I told my new wife I was just a retired school teacher living off a modest pension. I never mentioned the vineyard. Not the 43 acres in the Okanagan Valley. Not the tasting room my late wife and I built with our own hands over 20 years. Not the storage facility in Kelowna or the cabin property near Vernon that my son-in-law had been helping me manage since my daughter convinced me I shouldn't be doing it alone at 64. I had my reasons for keeping it quiet. Good ones, I thought at the time. Her name was Lorraine. She was 58 when we met at a grief support group in Penticton, about 14 months after I lost my wife of 31 years to pancreatic cancer. Lorraine had lost her husband 2 years before that, she said. A contractor. Complications from surgery. She had kind eyes and she laughed easily and she made the best butter tart I'd ever tasted outside of my mother's kitchen. She brought them to the 3rd session, and I still remember thinking that was a very specific kind of warmth. The kind you don't manufacture. My daughter was cautious from the start. She didn't say it outright, but I could feel it in the way she'd pause before asking how things were going with Lorraine. That particular pause a parent learns to recognize in their children, the one that means they're choosing their words carefully because they love you too much to just say what they're thinking. "She seems nice, Dad," she'd say. And then that pause. Her husband was more direct. He pulled me aside at Christmas dinner and said, quietly and without drama, "Just take your time, okay? There's no rush." He's a good man. He manages the vineyard operations now, and he's been doing it honestly and well for 6 years. He knew what was at stake more than anyone. Lorraine had a son. He was 26, she told me. Worked in sales in Kamloops. I met him twice before the wedding, both times briefly. He was pleasant enough. Shook my hand firmly, made eye contact, said the right things. I remember thinking he had rehearsed those conversations. I didn't think much of it at the time. I told myself I wasn't hiding the vineyard out of distrust. I told myself it was practical. I'd been taken advantage of before. Not in a marriage, but in a business arrangement early in my second career, a partnership that cost me considerably. And I'd learned that showing your full hand too early changed how people related to you. It wasn't deception. It was prudence. That's what I told myself. The truth, if I'm being honest about it now, is that I think I was also a little afraid. Not of Lorraine specifically. Afraid of what it meant to let someone fully into a life I'd built, mostly with someone else. The vineyard had been Eleanor's dream as much as mine. Her name was still on the original land title documentation, even though it had transferred after she passed. There were mornings I'd walk the rows at sunrise and still reach for my phone to call her. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't leave on any schedule you set for it. We got married in June. Small ceremony at the vineyard. I'd told Lorraine it belonged to a friend who was doing us a favor. My daughter stood beside me with a smile that I could see cost her something. My son-in-law was polite and warm and watchful, about 30 people total. Her son was there, and the woman he introduced as his girlfriend, and Lorraine's sister who had driven up from Osoyo's. The reception was lovely. The wine was, of course, very good. We came back to the house in Penticton that I'd bought after Eleanor died. Smaller, easier to manage. I'd kept the vineyard separate intentionally. My son-in-law lived in the adjacent property and handled day-to-day operations. Lorraine knew I went out there regularly. I'd told her it was consulting work for the friend who owned it. She'd never pushed on the details, which I now understand differently than I did then. It was 71 hours after the wedding when it started. I want to be precise about that because people ask, and I want them to understand how fast it moved. Not days, not weeks, 71 hours. I came downstairs on a Tuesday morning to find Lorraine sitting at the kitchen table with her son. He'd arrived the night before, which I thought was a little odd. We'd only been home from a short honeymoon in Victoria for 2 days, but Lorraine had said he wanted to celebrate with us. He had a folder open on the table. Lorraine had her hands wrapped around a coffee mug and she wasn't looking at me. "Morning," I said. Her son looked up. He had a different quality to him that morning. The rehearsed pleasantness was gone. What replaced it was something more settled, comfortable almost. "We wanted to talk to you about some things," he said. Not her. Him. I sat down. He explained, in a tone that was almost kind, that Lorraine had been doing some financial planning and had discovered some inconsistencies in how I described my situation. He used that word, inconsistencies. He said that as my wife, Lorraine had certain interests to protect going forward, and that they'd spoken to someone, a financial advisor, he said, who had helped them put together some paperwork. He slid the folder across the table. I opened it. It was a proposed amendment to our property arrangements. Not a legal document, technically, I could see that immediately, but formatted to look like one. It suggested that given our marriage, certain assets should be restructured to reflect our partnership, and it listed several items I had never disclosed to Lorraine. The Okanagan property, the Kelowna storage facility, the Vernon cabin. I looked up at Lorraine. "Where did you get this information?" I asked. She finally looked at me. Her expression was composed in a way that told me the composure had been practiced. "You weren't honest with me," she said. "You let me think you were living on a pension." "I never said that." "You let me believe it." Her son cut in. He said that wasn't the point. The point was that as a married couple in British Columbia, there were legal frameworks around shared property, and that they were simply asking me to acknowledge what existed and have a conversation about how to proceed fairly. He used the word fairly 3 times in about 90 seconds. I counted. I closed the folder and set it back on the table. I said I needed some time to think, and I went upstairs and called my son-in-law. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had just happened. There was a long silence. "I'll make some calls," he said. "Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything verbally. I'll be there by noon." He also said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have pushed harder." He's called me Dad for 6 years. He didn't have to do that, and I've never taken it for granted. I came back downstairs. Lorraine and her son were still at the table. I told them I wasn't going to be discussing anything without my family present, and suggested we reconvene later in the day. Her son's composure slipped just slightly at that. He hadn't expected that particular response. "This doesn't need to be complicated," he said. "It isn't," I said. "I'd just like my family here." My son-in-law arrived at noon with my daughter and with a woman I hadn't met before, a lawyer named Colette, who had done work for the Vineyard and who my son-in-law had called that morning. She was in her late 40s, calm, and carried a leather portfolio that looked like it had seen considerable use. We sat in the living room, all of us. Colette asked Lorraine's son whether the documents he presented that morning were prepared by a licensed professional. He said they'd been put together with advice from a financial consultant. She asked for the consultant's name. He couldn't produce it. Then Colette asked Lorraine a question I hadn't anticipated. She asked for Lorraine's full legal name as it appeared on our marriage certificate. There was a pause. Lorraine said her name. Colette opened her portfolio and placed a document on the coffee table. It was a search result from a provincial records inquiry, something my son-in-law had quietly initiated months earlier. I later found out, after a conversation with my daughter, where she'd finally said the thing she'd been holding back. The document showed that the name on our marriage certificate did not match the name associated with Lorraine's provincial health card, her previous address history, or the credit file attached to her social insurance number. The name she'd given me, the name on our marriage license, was not her legal name. The room was very quiet. Her son stood up. Colette looked at him and said, in the same even tone she'd used for everything, that she'd like him to sit back down, because there were a few more things to go through, and it would be easier for everyone if we finished the conversation here. He sat down. What followed over the next hour was methodical and, I think, deliberately calm on Colette's part. She explained that in British Columbia, a marriage entered into using a false name is considered void, or voidable under the Marriage Act, and that the specific circumstances here, including the timing of the financial approach and the involvement of the third party, would likely constitute grounds for an annulment application, as well as a potential referral to the RCMP for fraud-related review. She wasn't threatening. She was informing. I watched Lorraine during that hour. I was looking for something. I'm not sure what. Remorse, maybe. Or some crack in the composure that would let me see the person I thought I'd known. There were moments, one or two, where I thought I saw something real. A tightening around her eyes when Colette mentioned Eleanor's name in the context of the estate history. Something that looked almost like shame. But she didn't say anything. Neither did her son after that first moment. They left that afternoon. Her son drove. She didn't take much. A bag she'd had mostly packed, I noticed. Not after she left, but in the moment she brought it downstairs, which told me something about how certain she'd been of a different outcome. The annulment process took several months. It was not difficult, legally. Colette had been right about that. The false name was documented, the timeline of the financial approach was documented, and the RCMP did open a file, though I was told not to expect a swift resolution on that end. Fraud cases involving intimate partnerships are, apparently, complicated to prosecute in this country. A comment I later read somewhere said it seemed like a straightforward case. I understand why it looks that way from the outside. The reality of what has to be proved in court is something else. I found out, eventually, some of what I hadn't known. Her son wasn't her son. He was her nephew, as it turned out, 29 years old. The sister from Osoyo's had known about the arrangement and had played a peripheral role, though what that role consisted of exactly, I was never told in full detail. The grief support group, I asked the facilitator afterward, quietly, had been something Lorraine joined about 3 months before I met her. The facilitator couldn't tell me whether she'd actually lost a spouse. That one I've sat with. My daughter was angrier than I was for a long time. That's her nature. She loves fiercely and she holds on to the feeling of having been close to something going terribly wrong. I understand it. I've given her space to feel it, and we've talked about it honestly. My son-in-law handled it with a steadiness I'll always be grateful for. He told me once, a few weeks after everything settled, that he'd started the background search reluctantly because he didn't want to be wrong about Lorraine and have me blame him for it. He said he'd rather have found nothing. I believe him. The vineyard had a good year that fall. We brought in a strong Pinot Noir harvest, which Eleanor would have been pleased about. She always said Pinot was the most honest grape, because you couldn't fake it through a bad season. The tasting room was open on weekends through October, and I was there most of them. There's something I want to say to anyone who's been where I was. Not just the part with Lorraine, but the part before that. The part where you've lost the person you built your life around, and someone comes along who feels warm and real and like proof that good things can still happen. That feeling isn't stupid. It isn't weakness. Grief makes you open in ways that are genuinely human and genuinely beautiful, and the people who exploit that know exactly what they're doing. What I should have done differently isn't love less, or protect more, or close myself off. I should have trusted my daughter's pause. I should have let the people who loved me be part of the decision, instead of interpreting their caution as not wanting me to be happy. There's a difference between protecting your heart and keeping your people out of it. I know that now. I still walk the rows at sunrise sometimes. I still reach for my phone on certain mornings, but I don't reach for it quite as automatically as I used to, which isn't forgetting. It's just time doing what time does, slowly, honestly, without asking permission. That fall, I opened a bottle of the Pinot on the deck with my daughter and my son-in-law after the last weekend of the tasting season. We didn't talk about Lorraine. We talked about expanding the East Block and whether my grandson was old enough yet to start understanding what a dormant vine looks like in January, and my daughter said she thought he was, and my son-in-law said we'd try it and see. It was a clear night. The valley was very still. Some things you build over decades and they hold. That's what I kept coming back to, sitting there. Not everything gets taken. Some things just hold. I keep coming back to the folder on the kitchen table, the way it sat there, already open. The way Lorraine wasn't looking at me when I came downstairs. Those two details, small as they seem, told me everything I'd refused to see in the 14 months before that morning. That's the thing about consequences. They don't arrive as surprises, not really. They arrive as confirmations of things we already half knew and chose not to look at directly. I'd seen the pause in my daughter's face every time I talked about Lorraine. I'd noticed that Lorraine never pushed on the details of my consulting work, which wasn't in curiosity, it was patience. The patience of someone who already knew the answer and was waiting for the right moment to use it. I filed those observations away and told myself I was being uncharitable. The cost of that choice was nearly very high. What I've come to understand, sitting with all of it across a year now, is that the situation didn't happen to me randomly. It found the specific opening I'd left. I was a man who had lost the person he'd built his life around, who was quietly terrified of closing himself off so completely that nothing good could get back in. That's a real fear, and an honest one, but I let that fear make my decisions for me, and I kept the people who loved me at arm's length precisely when I needed them most. My son-in-law had done a background search reluctantly, months before everything fell apart, because my daughter had finally said the thing she'd been holding. That search is what unraveled the whole arrangement. If I'd been more willing to share what I was doing, if I'd had the good sense to say, "I'm thinking of marrying this woman, will you help me look into her properly?" we'd have known in a week what took us 14 months to learn. There's a kind of wisdom that only comes from being honest about what you don't know. I thought I was experienced enough at 64 to read people accurately, and maybe I am in ordinary circumstances. But grief isn't an ordinary circumstance. It changes what you want to be true, and that changes what you see. Wisdom, real wisdom, isn't assuming you're too old to be fooled. It's knowing exactly which conditions make you most likely to fool yourself. The resilience part. The part I'm most proud of, if I'm being honest, wasn't the legal process. Colette handled that. It wasn't even the decision to call my son-in-law that morning, though I'm glad I made it in time. The resilience was in what came after, going back to the vineyard that fall and being present for the harvest. Sitting on the deck with my daughter and talking about the East Block expansion. Letting myself still be a person who looks forward to things. Lorraine's nephew slid that folder across the table expecting a man who was alone and overwhelmed and slightly ashamed of having been fooled. What he found instead was a man who picked up the phone and called his family. That's the only difference in the end. Not money, not legal knowledge, not anything clever I did. Just the decision to let the people who loved me help carry it. The valley was very still that last night of the season. I thought about Onor, and I thought about the rows we'd planted together in the early years, and I thought that some things built with honesty simply don't come apart the way other things do. That's not luck. That's just what integrity does over time. Quietly, without announcement. It holds.